Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight. This is the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you about books, music, movies that I find interesting, that I enjoy, or a combination of the two. It's Saturday night here in Arctic Norway, and I have chosen to spend my evening talking to you about SCUM Manifesto by Valerie Solanas. SCUM Manifesto is a polemical text that was written and self-published by Solanas in the late 60s. I believe she self-published it in 1967, and she used to hand it out and give it out to around in the cultural scene or on the streets of New York in the late 60s. It became famous because she, 1 year later in 68, shot Andy Warhol in an attempted murder attempt. This was due to a conflict between Warhol and Solanas around the copyright of her play Up Your Ass. I'm not an expert in feminist theory, but as I understand it, there's some discussion about to the extent to which Solanas's book was influential or not. Certainly there were some groups of women who were inspired by it, but it's definitely been influential in other ways. I first heard of it, I think, in politics class at school, but there it was referred to as if it was an organization, the Society of Cutting Up Men, which is really a fictive organization that is kind of created as a marketing gimmick for the text. It's never referred to in the text. Some people believe that it was Solanas's first publisher who came up with this acronym, SCUM, the Society for Cutting Up Men. In the text, SCUM means something quite different. I might have heard of it first there or in the inlay of the Manic Street Preachers' first album, Generation Terrorists. They're a Welsh rock band that were very important to me when I was a teenager, and they quoted from this text in their album sleeve. They also based a song around it on the Holy Bible, a song called Walk in Abortion, which is a concept that we'll come back to. I know that later on Nick Cave has also referred to it as an influence on his novel The Death of Bunny Monroe. And one of my favorite ever artists, who is an artist called Jenny Holtzer, who creates a lot of text work, she's also referred to SCUM Manifesto as being very influential on some of the very polemical, radical writing styles that she's used in these posters that she used to post up around on walls on subways in New York back in the 70s and 80s, I think. So I'm going to talk about the contents of the book, and I'm going to kind of talk about how people have understood it a little bit, and I'm going to talk about my own opinions of this text and why I find it interesting. I will say kind of at the beginning that although this text is super provocative and in some ways quite confusing, I also find it very enjoyable because it's just very creatively written. It's very radical, imaginative, and it has this kind of fiery, energetic style. So even though if you're reading it as a man, all it's doing is telling you the entire time how absolutely abject and disgraceful men are, you kind of can't help but enjoy the beating, which is also kind of funny because I read today when I was just kind of genning up a little bit before I did the video so that I didn't say anything stupid. I read on the Wikipedia page that there was one event where Solanas invited people who wanted to kind of participate in the SCUM Manifesto's project to come and have a meeting in New York. And she said that only a few people turned up and they were all male masochists. Okay, so first paragraph in this book is, in my opinion, one of the great openings of any works of literature. She says, "Life in this society being, at best, an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex." So she's coming out of the gate strong, and she's basically telling you the agenda of the rest of the text, which is partially a massive critique of American society at the time, partially an explanation of why men should not be tolerated, and also partially a program for what she thinks would be a better world. At the beginning, she argues that men are like emotionally disabled, that they are driven to dominate women as an overcompensation for the fact that they have no like life they in them. They are incapable of positive emotions. They are kind of somewhere between the humans and the apes. They're less evolved, and she argues that a lot of the traits that we traditionally in Western culture associate with masculinity are actually female traits. That men are passive, sexual, incapable of emotional maturity, and that they have traditionally projected all of this onto women as a kind of overcompensation, and that they are driven to dominate women as a consequence of this. That they are also aware of their complete lack of masculinity, and that they therefore engage in sexual conquests and war as an attempt to try to convince themselves and those around them that they have this kind of strength and masculinity. She argues that men are kind of riddled with disgust both for themselves and for other men, and that they really would prefer to be women, and that that's what they actually aspire to. She also makes this kind of biologically determinist argument right at the beginning. She says that women have two X chromosomes, whereas men have an X and a Y. And the Y chromosome is a degraded version of the X chromosome, which means that the man is actually biologically an incomplete woman. And so that he's a walking abortion, which is where the Manic Street Preachers got this song title from. Man is an incomplete woman aspiring to be something he can never be. There technically is some truth in this, apparently. Like, I always thought it was wrong because I thought, okay, you have the X chromosome from the woman, and then the male sex cell introduces an X or a Y, which is adding something. You either add an X or you add a Y. So it's stupid to say that it's like incomplete. But I checked on the internet today, and like, I mean, I don't know what a cursory Google search can tell you, but it seems to me that actually there's some evidence that the Y chromosome originally had much of the genetic material that the X chromosome has, but over a long period of time has lost that genetic material, although it has also gained some other material. So I think she's actually based this on some scientific truth. That's kind of not the point of what she's doing, though, I think, because I think what she's doing is she's kind of creating a version of the kind of arrogant, essentialistic pseudoscience that a lot of male philosophers, scientists, and psychologists were producing from the late 19th century and up to the 60s, and which they were using as a kind of rationalization for patriarchal society and for, you know, women not being allowed to work in certain jobs, and like men having to look after women and women being like in the home. She's kind of creating like a reverse version of the same type of argument, and she actually studied psychology, so I think what she's doing is kind of using the same sort of arguments that she's read in Freud and psychoanalysis and other kind of sexist pseudoscience of the period. After a page or two of explaining everything that's wrong with men, she says what she thinks men are better at than women, which is public relations. She says, it should be said, though, that the male has one glaring area of superiority over the female: public relations. He has done a brilliant job of convincing millions of women that men are women and women are men. The male claim that females find fulfillment through motherhood and sexuality reflects what males think they'd find fulfilling if they were female. I thought that was kind of an interesting argument, because it is true that the description of the woman like throughout history has been written by the man. So it is the male's fantasy or projection of what he thinks the woman thinks and feels. I'm not going to go through every argument in SCUM Manifesto, because although it's a very short text, it's extremely dense. But one of the ones that she mentions in that introduction that I read which I kind of agree with also, or that I think is like one of the most challenging and interesting ideas, is that the only way to true liberation is to abolish money, to abolish the money system. She says, many females would, even assuming complete economic equality between the sexes, prefer living with males or peddling their asses on the street, thus having most of their time for themselves, to spending many of their days doing boring, stultifying, non-creative work for someone else, functioning as less than animals, as machines, or at best, if able to get a good job, co-managing the shit pile. What will liberate women, therefore, from male control is the total elimination of the money work system, not the attainment of economic equality with men within it. My opinion actually is that Solanas was very prescient in writing this, because the feminist program to get women into equality within the workforce, although it's certainly been important, you could argue that the vast majority of working and lower middle class women who don't really make a living wage, doing menial, degrading work, and then often still bearing the larger part of the load for domestic chores and work at home, hasn't really been any great success or any great liberation. The abolition of the money work system, as Solanas calls it, would create a situation where people were free to do whatever they wanted to do. Another thing that I thought was interesting in SCUM Manifesto in relationship to arguments in contemporary feminism is that maybe some of you will remember when there was a lot of stuff on the internet some years back about manspreading, or like men taking up space on public transport, and about men like approaching women, offering them opinions about what books they were reading, or like just kind of interrupting women while they were just going about their daily life. And there's like a section in SCUM Manifesto where she talks about how men create the prevention of privacy, about men approaching women and giving opinions. I don't know how I feel about this, because A, I'm not a woman, and B, I kind of feel like you can't really. I kind of feel like it's maybe a little unfair to create a situation where like it's considered aggressive just to be friendly towards people. But I think the issue is around like street harassment, men coming into feminist forums online just to argue with people. So I was reading this, I was like, okay, the prevention of privacy, that's an interesting way of framing that problem. Another interesting thing from a contemporary perspective about SCUM Manifesto is how Solanas talks about sex and sexuality. She makes this case near the beginning about men. She says men are capable of negative emotions like guilt, shame, self-disgust, but they're not capable of pleasure. The only thing that they're really capable of at best is relaxing for a short time. She says that men are incapable of pleasure and they're incapable of enjoying sex. So she says people say that men use women. Use them for what? Surely not pleasure. Which on the one hand seems kind of ridiculous, and I think again is like a gender flip about how men often used to write that women didn't get pleasure from sex. But it also made me think about Andrew Tate, who in many ways is the man that Solanas is describing in this book. It's like a guy who is incapable of affectionate relationships, who is focused on proving a masculinity that is quite clearly a defense against a sort of narcissistic collapse. And he has written online and on, I guess, on Twitter and on social media, like that having sex with women for more than a couple of minutes is gay, because you shouldn't be trying to experience pleasure from sex. The point being that like Solanas's description of men and masculinity, as stereotyped and as absurd as it can seem, is a description of the extremity of men's view of themselves and the world, and these men actually do exist, and that the online manosphere is essentially the same as the kind of antagonist that Solanas is imagining or describing or exaggerating within the text of SCUM Manifesto. Something else interesting about her attitude towards sex is that she is very direct about the reality of incest within families. She talks about the father being the source of mental illness in families, which again I think is a parody of Freud, maybe, because he writes a lot about the mother. But she writes as well that the father wants his daughter for sexual reasons, and she writes, he gives her hand in marriage, he keeps the rest for himself. You have to kind of wonder if Solanas isn't writing from experience. Certainly, incest and the abuse of children in families is a lot more prevalent than we like to admit. And this is something that I've become very aware of through my work as a therapist. Later on, she describes how women can condition themselves to be non-sexual, and she describes sex as something that is really not desirable, not beneficial, and that it's better to become kind of to deprogram your sex drive so that you don't feel sexual desire, and that, you know, real love is more in the form of women to women friendship, which made me wonder whether Solanas may have been subject to some pretty terrible experiences which she's drawing upon in the writing of this polemic. Another reason that I like SCUM Manifesto is that it has a kind of science fiction aspect. It's not often that you read like a political diatribe that has a science fiction speculative aspect, or maybe you read that more often now, especially in manifestos and such written by artists. But I think it's pretty interesting that in the 60s she was writing a manifesto where she was claiming that death and disease could be easily abolished, and that people hypothetically could live forever, that the future would be a situation where children would be created in vitro and only female babies would be created, but maybe it wouldn't even be necessary to create children at all, since everybody would be able to live forever. She describes a future where all work is automated and where the male sex is entirely destroyed. So about this term scum, this is SCUM Manifesto. Scum, in the way that Solanas describes it, is a term that describes women who are not polite, they are not nice, they are not interested in being daddy's little girl, they are not interested in playing the game of American civilization. She describes them as kind of like arrogant, bitchy, vital, risk-taking, exciting people. And she's as scathing about most women as she is about men. I'll read you a short example which kind of demonstrates this. She says, the conflict is not between females and males, but between scum. Dominant, secure, self-confident, nasty, violent, selfish, independent, proud, thrill-seeking, freewheeling, arrogant females who consider themselves fit to rule the universe, who have freewheeled to the limits of this society and are ready to wheel on to something far beyond what it has to offer. And nice, passive, accepting, cultivated, polite, dignified, subdued, dependent, scared, mindless, insecure, approval-seeking daddy's girls who can't cope with the unknown, who want to hang back with the apes, who feel secure only with Big Daddy standing by, and with a strong man to lean on, and with a fat, hairy face in the White House, who are too cowardly to face up to the hideous reality of what a man is, what daddy is, who have cast their lot with the swine, who have adapted themselves to animalism, feel superficially comfortable with it, and know no other way of life, who have reduced their minds, thoughts, and sights to the male level, who, lacking sense, imagination, and wit, have value only in a male society, who can have a place in the sun, or rather in the slime, only as soothers, ego boosters, relaxers, and breeders, who are dismissed as inconsequence by other females, who project their deficiencies, their maleness, onto all females, and see female as worm. I also think that's a great passage because it kind of demonstrates this crazy polemical style that she's writing, which is almost without full stops, just adjective after adjective, so descriptive, so exciting to read. The natural question at this point is, how does Solanas see this future come about? What is the program she is proposing? And SCUM's program is basically a kind of uncentralized anarchist terrorist program. There's no organizational structure, there's no real demands. There's just a description of how SCUM will behave, what they will do to bring about the end of American civilization as it has existed. SCUM will take jobs which they will basically use to sabotage society through unwork. She says SCUM will forcibly relieve bus drivers, cab drivers, and subway token sellers of their jobs and run buses and cabs and dispense free tokens to the public. SCUM will destroy all useless and harmful objects, cars, store windows, great art, etc. Eventually, SCUM will take over the airways, radio and TV networks by forcibly relieving of their jobs all radio and TV employees who would impede SCUM's entry into the broadcasting studios. SCUM will couple bust, barged into mixed male-female couples wherever they are and bust them up. SCUM will kill all men who are not men's auxiliary of SCUM. Men's auxiliary of SCUM is men who, through their attitude and behaviour, further the goals of SCUM. So in closing, I want to talk about what kind of text this is. There's been, I've mentioned this thing about it being like a parody of psychoanalysis, parts of it. This is something that I saw on Wikipedia has been mentioned before, although it seems like when people have written about this before, they've talked about it as being like a kind of parody that's trying to make evident how ridiculous psychoanalysis has been. I don't know if I wholly agree with that. I feel like it's Solanas using the same strategies deliberately to kind of create her own polemic, to reposition the argument, not necessarily to undermine those strategies, but more to make use of them herself. I also read again on the Wikipedia that there's been discussion about whether SCUM Manifesto can be read as a kind of Swiftian satire, which is to say in the same tradition as A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, where he wrote an article suggesting that the English should eat Irish babies as a solution to poverty in Ireland. And this article is also always referenced as like one of the great works of satire. I think it's wrong to say that SCUM Manifesto is Swiftian, because Jonathan Swift, in arguing that the English should eat babies, is taking his opponent's view of the Irish to the absolute logical conclusion to demonstrate how disgusting it is. He's exaggerating his opponent's viewpoint. I don't think Solanas is doing anything like that. I think that a lot of Solanas's criticisms of the world in SCUM Manifesto is exactly how she feels about the world, but she is using, exaggeration, polemic, rhetorical devices, provocation, in order to present it in a way that is kind of like fiery, provocative, exciting, and cathartic for her. It's a provocation, but it's more of a provocation in the style of like the surrealists or William Burroughs or the futurists, who would say things that were completely outrageous to the conventional person's perspective of the world in order to try to break it. I think it's more like a polemical political fantasy where she's living out through her writing a kind of angry wish. So in a way, it's like a scream. It's like a scream on the page. Since I opened with the first paragraph, I'll close with the last paragraph, which if you're a man watching this video and you're wondering what Solanas thinks you should think about all of this or how you should receive this text, she says at the end, "The sick, irrational men, those who attempt to defend themselves against their disgustingness, when they see scum barreling down on them, will cling in terror to Big Mama and her big bouncy boobies. But boobies won't protect them against scum. Big Mama will be clinging to Big Daddy, who will be in the corner shitting his forceful dynamic pants. Men who are rational, however, won't kick or struggle or raise a distressing fuss, but will just sit back, relax, enjoy the show, and ride the waves to their demise." I hope you enjoyed my discussion of this 1967 cult text, SCUM Manifesto from Valerie Solanas. It's been a pleasure. Hope to see you again. Take care.